see you now that we're all living in Biden's utopia. Really good to see everybody. I won't take too long, but welcome to the North Brooklyn Night School. If you've been here before, put in the chat if it's your first time. Would love to hear if it's people's first times. If you've been here before, great, because the classes are designed to build off one another. If you haven't, that's okay. We are aiming to make rigorous and accessible political education for all our fellow socialists, so we can think together. One of the, when I think about why political education is important, we're in DSA. DSA is like an activist-oriented organization. Like being in DSA, like you should be canvassing, you should be talking to strangers about socialism. It's one of the things that makes DSA like actually effective in the world. But it is also important for us to think together and to develop a common vocabulary and an analysis. And in my mind, it's kind of like three kind of areas we cover in night school and in political education. Generally, we talk through our values and we clarify kind of what matters to us and why our egalitarianism as socialists, what's important to us. We think through our strategy, kind of how we think about what society is like and how to change it and why society often doesn't match our values and what levers of power ordinary people have to transform the world. And then we orient ourselves towards action. Once we have a strategy, we want to achieve it. So we think how best to achieve it. So those are some of the things we do together in political education, and night school is a place to think through that stuff together and to get more involved as well in our activism. Today's session is on race and class. We're 5 sessions through the first semester. We still have sessions coming up on gender and capitalism and social movements. So I think that's about it. I will hand over the baton to Justin Charles, who's a North Brooklyn member. I think has been in DSA. We've been in DSA around the same amount of time. Part of the 2016 Trump bump. Correct me if I'm wrong, Justin. And he is currently on the National Political Committee and a great comrade. So thanks so much, Justin, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, comrades. North Brooklyn branch, Poly-Ed committee. I'm happy to be here doing this. I guess this is the 3rd time I've given this talk about race and class. It's great every time. We usually have a really rich discussion as a result. So I'm going to share my screen, so you're not just listening to me talk the whole time, because I know that's not fun. You actually have something to look at. Let's see, I think that's the one. There we go. All right. So, just a bit of an overview. These are the readings that were assigned for tonight. Audrey Bryan Smedley, Arrival of Africans and Descent to Slavery, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor reviewing W.E.B. Du Bois' review of Black Reconstruction in America, an interview by Dan Denver of the Field Sisters, and a piece by Assad Haider called The Shadow of the Plantation. So I kind of talk about the Fields and the Smedley together, and then talk about Reconstruction, the Yamahtta Taylor piece, and then the Haider piece. So yeah, let's get into it. The ideology of race. This is a quote that I think is pretty useful for grounding us before we start talking about ideology, that comes from the Fields interview. So I'll read it. When you come to a red light, you don't sit and ruminate on the philosophy about what you do at the intersection that is governed by a red light. You do have a reason why we stop for the red light, and there is an explanation that actually makes a lot of sense. The explanation is that everybody understands that regardless of our respect for the law or not, we need to know what everybody is doing at the intersection. We have lights there, or stop signs, or some other convention, but there is nothing material like that, so that everybody knows what everybody will do at the intersection. When you are a teenager and your parents teach you how to drive. They will tell you what you are supposed to do at a four-way or at a red light or at a flashing yellow, and so on. That is an approximation of an ideology. It's what you need to know to get through the day. I think the way that the fields deal with ideology, and if you've read, there's another piece that we used to read for this that I think is pretty good, but I think this one does a little better job encapsulating what this is about. There's another reading that they have called, I was looking at it a second ago, Slavery, Race, and Ideology in the United States of America. And in that piece, Barbara Fields uses, metaphor analogy again. I have a duplicate slide here, my bad. Uses metaphor and analogy again to kind of say, like, think about ideology as terrain. Ideology is kind of like, this is like your understanding of that's a hill over there, or that's the sidewalk, or that's a building over there, or all these things that like one has to understand in order to navigate their life in like at the most basic fundamental way, but doesn't really think about. It's just kind of like, this is the stuff, we understand it. That's ideology. One could say the same thing about, until you've been, red pilled like us into socialism. Capitalism operates the same way. This is just kind of like, this is how things work. And you don't think about it, you don't question it until you do. And when they talk about in that reading is, the terrain then changes when you're able to kind of slough off ideology. And therefore your map of that terrain, your internal understanding of that terrain changes. So that's what I think we're doing here in PolyEd too, is like helping to kind of change that terrain and that map. But anyway, back to the reads we actually did for tonight. So in the Smedley reading, I'm gonna spend a lot of time talking about the Smedley reading because I think it's a really good like way of rooting ourselves in how this problem started and how the ideology of race came to be. I've got a bunch of quotes and I've got a bit of like my take on what's being said, but we'll go into this one from page 97. What's indisputably clear is the beginning of the latter part of the 17th century, major social and economic transformations began to take place that eventually obliterated the uncertain status of Africans and their descendants. Through the passage of various laws, Negroes were separated out from their other servants and gradually reduced to the status of permanent hereditary slavery. North American slavery was not the result of a single law or single court decision, but of numerous individual acts, decisions, and practices that over time became codified into the legal framework of colonial society. What was said before this in this reading, it kind of talks about how we didn't necessarily have like, I think a lot of people think, okay, well, I'm an English dude, or I'm a Spanish dude, or I'm a Portuguese dude, and there's these people on this continent, and they are, inherently inferior, and therefore they should be slaves, and that's just the way it is. And we understand these people to be Black or Negro or colored or whatever you want to call it, and that's just their role. That wasn't the case. What really happened was, and I'll go on to talk about this, when we talk about race and racism, we often talk about, and slavery, we talk about slavery as kind of like this, like, yes, it's a morally reprehensible institution, but we talk about it in terms of like, the white man hated the Black man so much that he put him in bondage, and made him do all the work in his fields to harvest his crops so he could sell them. And he did this because the Black man was inferior. That's not false in terms of how the reading from that white man may have been, but like, you had to get there somehow. And the way that you got there was from the jump, a need for labor and a problem of labor. So let's talk about this problem of labor. Actually, wait, I skipped a step. My bad. Yeah. Okay. So the transformation into slaves. Smedley quotes here: rapid succession, Afro-Americans lost their right to testify before court, engage in commercial activity, all of these things that, like, you know, and you wouldn't even think, like, if you didn't necessarily do the reading about the history of slavery in the United States, you wouldn't necessarily think, oh wow, people could do all these things at some point. You know, people who we know understand to be slaves could do these things, and those rights were stripped away over time. And stripped away over time, you know, I think in order to secure what is a labor force. So again, about this labor force, at this time you had, you know, I think you didn't really have this solidification of chattel slavery and Black people as the only people who will be, you know, victims of lifetime servitude under slavery. Before that, I mean, there were, you know, there were indentured servants, and they were of varying European descent. They tried to have indigenous people do the work, and that didn't work out. And there's reasons why that didn't work out, and there are reasons why ultimately it fell on African people and people of African descent that were designated as slaves. So first you have your indigenous, your native people. Not ideal. Didn't have the immunity to disease that Europeans carried. We know all about the smallpox blankets and such. Being on their own land made it easy to escape. They kind of knew what they were doing in this area, more so than the slavers, the colonizers. There weren't enough of them, you know, to do the kind of industrialized, I mean, for the time, industrialized agriculture. And this wasn't something that they were used to doing. So indigenous folks, not ideal. Then you have your Europeans, Irish people particularly, but Europeans in general. Not ideal for designation as the group of people that do this work, because you have a level of linguistic and cultural homogeneity, so people actually can communicate with each other with relative ease. You don't have an inclination toward agriculture. If they run away, they just look like everybody else, so they can blend in. People back in Europe began to hear about how bad it was to be a worker in the United States. And there became a decreasing supply of white indentured servants over time. So that leaves us with Africans being the logical workforce because of being visibly discernible from the European descended folks, having an increasing and I guess relatively easily accessible supply of African labor. The fact that it was cheaper to buy a slave for the duration of their life than it was to get an indentured servant. Having experience with agriculture, where, you know, back in Africa, having immunity to old world diseases. This was talked about in the text, you know, but trade between the African continent and the European continent was totally normal. Like this happened. There was, like, these people had met before and engaged in, you know, in commerce. So there wasn't that problem there is with the indigenous population of disease and just kind of not having any way of fighting it. And then finally, the vulnerability of being, you know, in a totally new continent with no community, no political support, oftentimes people not speaking the same language. I mean, that combination of circumstances makes for kind of an ideal population to be subjugated. So when we talk about the invention of the black race, and I think in the invention of the white race as well, Snelly talks about Theodore Allen, and Theodore Allen is great. I highly recommend people read The Invention of the White Race. Shows the way in which the granting of greater opportunity for European descendants and the reduction of Africans and their descendants to lifetime slave status became a mechanism of social control, not just for those who we understand to be black, but ultimately for those we understand to be white. What I mean by this is, like, you know, all the stuff that I've just talked about, that I've just mentioned, of the, over time, the kind of grinding down of, you know, I guess one's access to civic, I guess, citizenship, or, you know, civic personhood, or whatever you want to call it, being kind of taken away bit by bit. If you're, you know, someone of Irish descent, maybe your people before you were born were indentured servants. Maybe those people worked alongside somebody of African descent. But like, as time goes on and you see, like, that person over there, they are not allowed to engage in commerce. They can't, like, go to the market and buy, you know, a piece of bread or whatever. They can't do basic things like that. And it seems like the reason they can't do those basic things is because they are what we know to be slaves, and they are slaves, I think, maybe because their color of skin is that shade and mine's this. So that shade of skin bad, this shade of skin good. Okay. That and that becomes, you know, in the same way that, like, when I first talked about ideology, and a kind of repetition of behavior that, like, one has to keep in one's head in order to get through the day, that becomes part of that. You know, it's just kind of like, okay, that person over there is this status and I'm over here. Even though if you're a white person, and you're not of the plantocracy, you're not of the slaving class, you probably at this time do not have it that good. But at least you're not black, and at least you're not a slave. And that's kind of it. So in summary, the process of advancing slowly along the road to a full-scale slave society, English colonists gradually transferred an institution, indentured servitude, into a form of permanent slavery for people of African origin. While doing so, they initiated the development of a unique and subtle ideology about human differences, not the least of which was the homogenization of all Europeans into a white identity, and of all those with African ancestry and identity as Negroes and slaves. As they were creating the institutional and behavioral aspects of slavery, the colonists were simultaneously structuring the ideological components of race. The practices and customs of black slavery and white freedom thus helped form the basis for the racial worldview. By the latter part of the 18th century, we see race appearing not merely as a subdivision of interacting populations in the colonies, but one, an intellectual construct about human differences and power relationships, and two, a novel and unprecedented quality introduced into the structuring of social status. This is the only slave system whose rationale became uninhibitedly and exclusively racial by increasingly limiting perpetual servitude to Africans and their descendants. The colonists are proclaiming that blacks will forever be at the bottom of the New World social order. By keeping blacks, Indians, and whites socially and spatially separated and enforcing endogamous mating, they were making sure that visible physical differences would be preserved as the premier insignia of unequal social statuses. And this way they institutionalized exclusive group membership and paved the way for later rationalizations of group distinctiveness in terms of natural inbred inequality. Yeah. So, I think, I guess it's in some ways this reading, like, it begins with the question of like, what if race and racism are chicken and egg problems? Which came first, race or racism? Well, I wouldn't really definitively answer it, but I would say it's a bit of a feedback loop. At some point, it became the idea of kind of like race as this thing came about, I think, in part because of racism, and racism being like, I think, the need to kind of separate this group of people for the specific purpose of having a labor force that was totally controlled, and then controlling the rest of society, and these things kind of working on each other back and forth forever until it's kind of this awful thing that we have now. So that's fun and depressing. But moving on, we can talk about something a little bit more fun, which is great, and I love to talk about. I think all of us on the left should get more familiar with, what was the unfinished revolution of this country, the Civil War and Reconstruction, which is like a period of American history that's just like, I don't feel like enough people know about it, and it's kind of amazing that it even happened. But before we get into that, really, from the Taylor reading, more than 2/3 of white Southerners did not own slaves. Moreover, many who did own slaves owned one or two, and often worked side by side with their slaves, tending crops. According to Du Bois, only 7% of the total Southern population owned almost 3 million of the 4 million enslaved blacks. Above all else, the South was an extreme and rigid class society in which everyone had a prescribed place: slaves, masters, and impoverished small white farmers. So something that the Smedley reading gets into is kind of how the ideology of race and the slave society structures the class society. Like, it became like the understanding of slavery as like an economic institution, which it 100% was, is one thing, but it was also like a way that it was a kind of way of structuring society as a whole. And when you have the Civil War, and you have kind of what's one, I should emphasize, you should really read Black Reconstruction. It's an amazing text. It's hard to read. It's a big one, but it's like, it'd be a great text for a reading group, if NBK Polyed wants to take it on. But Du Bois talks about slaves, and slaves they laid down their tools of labor and they walked away. He talks about like when the Union came through, people were like, okay, I'm going to be out. I'm done with this. We're going to get free. And people put down their shit and just walked away. We're talking about a general strike of slaves, which is amazing. There are all sorts of there are a lot of, for me to say that was the entirety of all the circumstances that led to the emancipation of African people and African descended people who had been enslaved, would not be correct, but like that has power in it. So when we talk about the slaves walking away, the Union coming in and basically, talking about people like having their land taken away, that didn't last, but having slavers having their land taken away, all that, it's just like, whew, man, it's the good stuff. But anyway, I'm getting excited. Another Taylor quote here for the first time, or actually this is a Du Bois quote, I think. Yeah. Here for the first time, there was established between the white and black of this country a contract on terms of essential social equality and mutual respect, freeing of the nation from the strangling hands of oligarchy in the South, freed not only black men, but white men. So that first quote, talked about the kind of the slaving class, the planting class, like they ran things. They owned all the capital in that they owned most of the land and the crops that it produced. They owned the overwhelming majority of the enslaved people who worked those crops. Breaking that up is like, well, shit. Because you have all these people who were not slavers, the majority of the, not just the black population, but the white population. What happens then? And then you have like kind of from there with the Freedmen's Bureau and institutions like the Union League, a real like democratic flourishing in the now liberated South. You have, education, for everybody, for everybody, white and black. You have people who are able to kind of like share, people who are able to like have their own farming, their own crops, and not be doing it for somebody else. You had, I think like, it's, of course it didn't last, but like I like to like have like do like the thought experiment of like, what if like Abraham Lincoln hadn't died and he had made sure the Union troops stayed around in the South during Reconstruction a bit longer, and was able to kind of fight back against reaction because you had the planting class being responsible for like a lot of like we have the Ku Klux Klan comes into existence and uses kind of like a lot of the kind of racist tactics and ideology that becomes the white working class at the time becomes susceptible to some extent. To a great extent. And a lot of the gains that were made, I'm talking about like, a lot of black, there were black legislators through all levels of government in these emancipated states. Hundreds of freedmen entering into service in state legislatures. Big plans that Lincoln had for what this would look like had he not died. But I think like, I guess the point I'm getting at is like with the access to like, with freedom and kind of having access to civic, rights, privileges, what have you, like for black people, it also meant that like white folks who had previously been, under the boot of this planting class also had a chance to get free. Eventually, you have, Andrew Johnson kind of kneecaps everything about Reconstruction, and eventually it goes away. There were black codes. There were vagrancy laws basically put in force to keep Black people on certain parcels of land as a labor force. So like the planting class kind of like reconstitutes itself basically. But I think like, one, yeah, I'm gonna say again, we should do a North Brooklyn Reconstruction reading group. It would be a great one. But this is a, you know, racism was not like this thing that just existed in people's heads. This is where I think it's key for socialists, for Marxists, to think about race and racism. I'm going to read this quote. It's a good one. For Du Bois, racism is not metaphysical, nor does it exist autonomously from class. Its development is a result of one class's efforts to keep power from another. Du Bois does come up with this famous formulation of poor whites gaining a psychological wage as opposed to a material wage from racism. The psychological wage was to make the white worker feel superior because he was not Black, even though he would have nothing material to show for it. But this does not contradict Marxism. Frederick Engels first used the term false consciousness in the 19th century, an idea George Lukács would later develop fully. False consciousness is simply ruling class ideology that is used to explain away or cover up material reality, usually rationalized as common sense or ideology. Yeah, common sense is ideology. I don't even think about it. Anyway, the point is what white workers, to the extent that they accepted white supremacy, contributed to capitalism's ability to exploit them more effectively. The purely psychological benefit covered over the very real material deficit that racist oppression helped reinforce. So, I think that's like, you know, there's a lot we can learn from reading Du Bois, and it's still applicable today. And I think, you know, it's funny, you know, I saw it on Twitter the other day, where James Clyburn was talking about, you know, socialism being the problem for all these people, all these shitty centrists who lost their seats. And in the background is a picture of W.B. Du Bois. Wow, James Clyburn, did you know W.B. Du Bois? Not only a socialist, a communist. Who'd have thunk it? Anyway, so talking more about like this connection between race and class, Taylor says struggles would move forward, but then be pulled back by racism. And even where there were challenges to racism, whether in the coal mines of Alabama or the docks of New Orleans, the employers could still use racism to break down solidarity. The pressures of societal racism would, moreover, be back on as soon as a particular struggle ended. Yeah, so for me, another book that we did a reading group on in North Brooklyn was Prisoners of the American Dream by Mike Davis. And in that book, I mean, it talks about kind of like the history of like labor more than anything in this country, but like efforts to have like left parties or socialist parties or labor parties, and the goal being building working class power. And the thing that always killed it over and over and over and over and over and over again was this shit. Like the inability to form any kind of solidarity. And like, you know, so my hope is this new left that we're building, this new strong left, can learn some lessons from that, and not make the same mistakes over and over again. We have to figure out a way to think race and class at the same time, and to not like. Well, I'll get to that with the Hayder reading, but just to close it out on the Taylor, without a consistent political intervention challenging racism inside the working class, it was impossible for these struggles to progress beyond a certain point. But the end of slavery raised the potential for a united struggle of the oppressed and exploited against capital. And this, beyond the assertion of Black rights and self-determination, is the lasting importance of slavery's overthrow. Yeah, I mean, Reconstruction is like a really fascinating period. There's a lot of, you know, the seeds of, I think, what could be, and we can. It's not just history. I mean, we can take it and we can apply it today. So, final plug: Black Reconstruction Reading Group, North Brooklyn, 2021. Let's do it. On to the Hyder reading, and then I'll shut up. We only got 4 slides to go, and then we can do the fun part. So before I get into these quotes, like, this reading talks about Cedric Robinson and Black Marxism, talks about the term racial capitalism, talks about Harry Haywood, member of the CPUSA. Really great. The stuff that the quotes from this article from Haywood, like, you should read the source material. And talks about kind of Black nationalism and separatism, and Haywood's kind of thinking on that. And I think to many, so Haywood had this idea, and it's in the reading if you didn't read it, but I'll try and summarize here. He had this idea of basically the Black Belt thesis, about, you know, descendants of slaves in this strip of, you know, very fertile region from, like, you know, I guess from like Mississippi River, I guess, to, like, you know, bit of Virginia. But that being, like, you know, a place where there were a lot of people who were descendants of slaves. That region constituting a nation, deserving of, you know, liberation and self-determination. Now, the idea that, like, there should be like an independent nation for the descendants of enslaved people in this little bit of the South. I don't know about that, but I do, and I think, you know, Hyder gets at, like, the usefulness of talking about self-determination, and all the stuff that got us to this place, and its relationships to imperialism, colonialism, etc. That's really useful for us. But let me get into it. So, talking about the Robinson, I'll read the quote real quick. Robinson's elaboration of the term racial capitalism identifies profoundly important characteristics of the historical development of the world market and its recomposition of the global population, nations, migration, slavery. It remains, like Hegel's, civil society, an ideological notion. Even the most superficial interpretation of the term implies the existence of a non-racial capitalism, that is, a capitalism which did not emerge and develop within a world market that incorporated racial slavery. There is no such capitalism except as a fictitious a posteriori construct. So the word or the term racial capitalism, I think, often, you know, nowadays gets used and thrown around, I think, and probably misused. I'm not a big fan of the term. I think if you study the history of capitalism, within it, you know all of this history. You know all of the ways that, you know, American capitalism was built on the backs of Black people who built the wealth for this country on land stolen from indigenous people. Like, you know that. So, and you know the ways that, I know the ways that capitalism, you know, affects Black people, Latino people, in ways, that like, are often worse. So I mean, I think racial capitalism, I understand why people like to use the term, but it's not my favorite. I prefer to just say capitalism. We can fight about that later when we get into the discussion. But I'll keep moving. On to the Haywood. How did capitalist force and coercion come to be exerted along racial lines? A 1930 polemic by Harry Haywood with the extraordinary title "Against Bourgeois Liberal Distortions of Leninism on the Negro Question in the United States." That's a mouthful. Attempts to answer the question. He declared, "Race as a social question exists only for the ideologists of the bourgeoisie and in the minds of those eluded by them. The basic move of this ideology was to imbue differences within the human species, such as color of skin, texture of hair, etc., with a social meaning, and on this basis claim the existence in nature of master and slave races." Going back to the Smedley reading, and the Fields reading too. This does not mean, however, that race was simply an illusion. Race theories arose to provide a moral justification for colonial policies and thereby took on real political forms which perpetuated the underlying relation of exploitation. So I think like, I put this quote in because I think it's important. I think often some folks in the movement, who are fans of the Field sisters, who I think write good stuff, will say, well, there's no biological basis for race, therefore, like, why are we even talking about it? That's not it. Don't do that. Yes, there's no biological basis for race. It's a thing that allows people, separate people and control people, perpetuate relations of exploitation, etc. But I think like we can't do our job as socialists and defeat capitalism if we're just gonna like yada yada away people's experience of race and their experience of their class exploitation as it relates to their racial oppression. We can't just like sweep that under the rug. We have to think them both at the same time. So cool. It followed. This is about Haywood and on Marcus Garvey, and Marcus Garvey's kind of like, let me try and kind of like black separatism, which kind of would seek to kind of sweep up this kind of like disenfranchised black underclass alongside, a kind of black owning class in a way, a black business class. And there are a lot of contradictions therein. Haywood's, I think, understanding of the Negro question as it relates to like a nation, going back to the Black Belt thesis, and self-determination. It followed that the demand for Black self-determination was not the special interest of a racial group, as Haywood wrote, represents the basic interests of the impoverished white minority of the region, whose backwardness and distress are anchored in the oppression of the Negro masses, since they can be freed only through uncompromising support for the full rights of the Negro people. So this is I'm going to close and then we can do the fun part. But like, I mean, for me, I think we've seen, in current events with what happened this summer with the uprisings, like, I think we have to commit to Black liberation substantively, and socialists. I think we have to commit to everybody's liberation, like, it sounds like a cliche at this point, but like, until everybody's free, I'm not free. I think that's what we all have to be saying to ourselves. that there was a kind of permanent underclass in the South, post Reconstruction, who, exploited as tenant farmers, as sharecroppers, black and white. And then, this was talked about in the Hayter reading. Then you have industrialization and more automation of the work that folks were doing. People had no work. They had to migrate. They had the Great Migration to the north. This is where the title of the article comes from, the shadow of the plantation following people as they migrated north, still experiencing racial oppression, getting into a factory in an more industrialized setting, and getting, less pay for more work. If somebody can do that to this person because of the color of their skin, and you're a white person, and you look at that and you're like, well, I got a little bit more change in my pocket, and I get to say that I'm white. I mean, how good are you doing? How good could you be doing if you teamed up with those folks that are getting fucked over and fought for more on that shop floor and in your neighborhood and your building, in our political system, et cetera. All right, I'm gonna close it out. Looking forward to the discussion. I think there's some discussion questions too, that I'll be sharing with you, but thanks everybody.
Thank you so much, Justin. Super timely discussion, I think. And yeah, like you said, really great. And we do have discussion questions. I think we wanted to give it a couple of minutes for folks who do want to ask questions to Justin directly. So just to go over our community agreements really quickly. As usual, we want to assume best intentions, be comradely to each other. Everyone's here to learn and to come out with something new. So if you do have a question, just go ahead and put yourself on stack in the chat just by typing stack like I'm about to do right now. And probably just like a few questions, and then we can do our separate breakout groups where we can do our individualized discussions. And if you can, just please try to keep your questions brief so that we can have time for everything on our agenda. Thanks so much again.
Andrew, you can go ahead.
Real.
Oh, did you have a question?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. It was, and it's, someone working like in progressive media for almost a decade and covering, these things in detail. My main thing was in regards to at least making sure that we have, and my question was in regards to having that representation, in regards to making sure that gets represented in terms of these issues. Because, one thing that I saw with Jacoba magazine when I went to the event before COVID hit was the fact that the representation was really lacking in terms of these things. So my thing is in regards to just how we do this representation, particularly me being a Bed-Stuy native here, north part of Brooklyn, about how we go about these things and how we're representing both from not only like a media standpoint for DSA, but not only in North Brooklyn, but throughout like the city and the state and in regards to that. So, just my question about that is in regards to how we present our representation in regards to these issues where it's not just only Black issues, but issues for really all Americans.
Should I respond? Do you want to take in a few more questions or what?
What do you prefer?
I'll forget what people say if we do 3 at a time. I'm gonna do 1 at a time. Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, I think like the left, I think, and this is not to say that there isn't like, there aren't, Black folks or people of color on the left, but I think, in DSA in particular, I mean, we have demographic problems we're trying to work through. I think the kind of left ecosystem, I think, yeah, it could be better. But at the same time, though, I mean, like, I'm not in the media, but I am, a leader of one of the leaders of this organization. I'm part of the National Political Committee of DSA, which is our political leadership. And on that body, we have, I'm gonna count now. We got a lot. We got a good number of people of color in that body as leaders, out, propagandizing, advocating for socialism, and I think that means something. I think that helps legitimize us in the eyes of people who are doubtful, who are ready to, like, kind of, dismiss the idea of socialism as some kind of, like, white gentrifier ideology. Like, no, the history of socialism. I mean, look at the people we're talking about tonight. Du Bois, for example, or Harry Haywood. Those are just two people. There are so many more. The history is big and broad, and I think the history is papered over a lot of the times, amongst both Black and white folks, the radical history, of Black folks. But I agree with you that, like, we could see more representation, I think, in left media, and we'll get there. I don't have a better answer than that. Sorry, bro.
Hey, I'm maintaining to handle that on my end. So, just wanted to get everything started with you.
All right.
Yep.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Next up, we just have Lee. And Lee, if you want to go ahead, and then, yeah, just a reminder, red stack if you have a question. Oh, Lee, I think you're muted.
Yeah, oh, there you go. Okay, so I just wanted to go back to the right of self-determination stuff that you were talking about, the Haywood stuff, and to me, that's important. I was part of a history that said that was key, that without that, it was hard to build an alliance. And if you look at strategy, you have to say that in the US, strategically, the realignment that has to happen is a realignment, a conscious realignment, between the working class, the working people, the trade union movement, and the Black liberation movement, the Black freedom movement. And that has to be conscious realignment on both sides. For both groups, they need to say, we understand that realignment is the key strategic, the conscious realignment is the key strategic development that needs to go into place to make progress towards socialism. And we always said that if you don't have the right to self-determination, you don't have to be for it. You don't have to say, oh yeah, we think there should be a separate, but you have to say the right. In other words, people who feel that the right to self-determination, that self-determination is important, those are within that group. Those are not outside it. Even if it's separatism, we take that in it, not outside it. And I think that's a key distinction that people look at when the time comes to say, are these people real or are they not real? So to me, that's a key thing. And I feel like within the the DSA type movement, there's not real clarity on that. And it could, in the long run, cause problems. So I was wondering your opinion on that.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, I mean, I think it's not to me that, when I was talking about not really being sold on the national question in like a tangible, like, this is a place in the South with a border that's, a different place that's for this group of people. like, I think that, to me, self-determination, it can mean that, and I think it's often read as meaning that, but I think self-determination also is like very much in line with everything that like we often talk about in DSA, which is like, you know, the power to determine the course of one's own life. And that means like economic power and political power. So I'm not, I mean, and I think that also aligns with, you know, a kind of more, you know, universalist, you know, idea about class struggle, even though it might sound like it's something that's something separate. And I think for, like, I think, you know, the way that the left, for example, might engage with the uprising this past summer, and might, you know, want to be dismissive of the fact of like, you know, moving for Black Lives or Black Lives Matter for any number of reasons, you know, okay, so segments of this movement aren't sufficiently anti-capitalist, or segments of this movement are not, or are like too, you know, sullied by the nonprofit industrial complex. That might all be true. It is. But at the same time, where there's movement for liberation amongst an oppressed and exploited people, I think it's our responsibility as socialists to be in it, and to advance it. So, I mean, I think if that's an effort to support self-determination, then like that is a way for us to do that. I hope that's a kind of answer to your question, Lee.
Great. So then I have Sarah on stock, and then after that, Jeremy. And we're probably gonna go around up until 8:10 before moving out into breakout groups. So if you have a question, we can probably take one or two more. So Sarah, if you want to go ahead.
Hey, Justin, thanks for being here. Much appreciated. So I guess my question is, I guess I have a lot of questions, but it's really all about this one topic. So in recent months, we've seen like some Black people on the left, people like Brianna Joy Gray and like Adolph Reed, starting to write about this issue of race reductionism. So I'm wondering if you could share your thoughts on the topic and what you think the role of Black people on the left should be in this conversation.
Oh man, it's about to get spicy. Spicy. That's a spicy meatball. Okay. No, thank you for the question, Sarah. Well, okay, like I think so. People on the left that talk about race reductionism or how awful identity politics is or whatever, they're right and they're wrong. I'll put it this way. Like, I think the liberals and our neoliberal politics, 100% like weaponizes identity politics for non-liberatory ends. Weaponizes, you know, I think, you know, the caricature of like the Democratic Party as being all about representation and not about economics, you know, working class people's concerns, you know, it's a stereotype based in reality. I mean, I do think mostly the Democratic Party doesn't give a fuck about working people, and would rather, like, you know, pretend to be by, you know, doing all sorts of things that they do. I think though that like there's a kind of like overcorrection by some on the left toward anything that, like, you know, oh, you know, that smacks of gender or race or whatever, what have you. Like, and just like freaking out about it is like what are you after there? Like, I think Adolph Reed's done some really good work and made some really, really important contributions to the left. There was a reading that we actually used to do for this session. That's one of my favorite Adolph Reed readings, where it talks about kind of some of the stuff that Smedley talks about in the reading that we did about the kind of deprivation of rights. But this is more from like a much more current time period, and how that accumulates to like, this is what this race is. I agree with you, Andrew. But and somebody's gonna come and light me up on Twitter about that. But I agree with you, Andrew. It's like I think what you mentioned, Brianna, Joy Gray, Sarah. I think like, like man, this is rough. We could do a whole course about this, multiple week course about this stuff. But we probably should, because it's not going away, this problem.
And Justin, real quick, can I say something real quick? Because knowing Bree, working at the Intercept, before with that, it's something where, some people really may feel that it could be like individual based with that in terms of the whole like analysis with that. So, in terms of, thinking that it's just, her perspective, and how some people may say, well, is this really representative of Black leftists completely? And how like those, additional voices, really required with that. But yeah, it is something that won't be going away anytime soon with that.
Thank you, Andrew. I don't want to talk too much more about it, but I will say that like so the drama that happened over this Adolph Reed event that was going to happen in Lower Manhattan Branch, and about racial disparity as it relates to COVID. There are people who would probably talk about, racial disparity before they would, try and give anybody universal health care. Yeah, that's true. And yeah, poor people are the ones dying of COVID, at higher rates than anybody else. But like, disproportionately, who is poor, and how did that happen? These are questions that we can't just sweep under the rug, and I think they're important for us to be able to actually have an understanding and analysis of like why we're at the place we're at and how we get out of it and how we actually get to some semblance of solidarity. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. I don't know if that was the satisfying answer, Sarah. I could talk about this forever. I do talk about this ad nauseum with closer comrades, and I get spicy. But yeah, if you want to hear more, DM me. I will tell you. Do we have another question?
Yeah, no, definitely. I encourage asking Justin about it at length. It's always a fun conversation to have. We just had Jeremy on Stack, and then I'm closing it out before breakouts.
Thanks so much, Justin. I think, one thing I think you brought out, which I think is helpful, and like, broadly, I think we do this in several of the sessions, thinking about like sort of how socialists think about an issue and how liberals might. And one of the things you pointed out, which is just like the idea that like racism has like an origin, it has like a specific socio-historical kind of like beginning, and sets of institutions that perpetuate it, that it isn't sort of a deep character of psychology, it's like involved in power, and thus we can change it and possibly end it. I do think that's like very helpful to think about, and not the way we naturally, like not the way we learn about these things in grade school, or whatever. I guess it's sort of along the lines of the last question, but also more, I remember reading Alicia Garza of, the kind of first Black Lives Matter movement, has an organization that put out like a survey that did like sort of a pretty substantial like survey of Black Americans and what their political priorities were. And sort of unsurprisingly for socialists, the three main political priorities for Black Americans were wages, jobs, and healthcare. It's unclear as of now in the political world that we're going to see any movement on any of those. And on the other hand, though, if we look at the press, like, you know, the fact that Kamala is the first Black woman, I mean, it's kind of funny because it's sort of like, they're like, Joe Biden won and Kamala Harris made history, is sort of like the tone of the press, as some way possibly one could be vaguely excited about Joe Biden winning. I guess my question is sort of like, what does this mean for like Black politics in the US over the next few years? Like, we've already seen, you know, greater divisions within Black Americans, like everywhere between young and old. But is this like, you know, is there going to be a sense of sort of like, you know, whatever Jim Clyburn and Black voters in the South delivered the vote to Biden, they're going to be glad for it? Or is there going to be greater divisions? Or kind of what do you anticipate being kind of the tenor and the possible fault lines of Black politics over the next few years that socialists can help organize?
Well, I mean, I think you know, seeing what's happened over the past few days, so, you know, election gets called for Biden, we start talking about transition, we start talking about cabinet appointments, and who might be in that cabinet, and we see, you know, tech industry people and, you know, Republicans and, you know, CEOs and what have you. Like, I see more of the same. We'll see what happens, what actually happens in practice. But I mean, I don't know, my expectations are not very high. Basically, I see like this election is kind of like, okay, so we go back to the politics that got us Donald Trump. Unless, you know, somebody decides to do something differently. And, you know, for Black people, I mean, yeah, I mean, you know, people, liberals, like, are all like, yeah, you know, Black people fucking saved us again. This is great. Black people really got out to the polls this time and saved us. Okay, so like Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, this Democratic House of Representatives, maybe there'll be a Democratic Senate if the Georgia runoffs work out. What are y'all going to do on those issues that you talked about, Jeremy? What are y'all going to do on, you know, jobs and healthcare, on income inequality? Because, like, you know, I mean, and the conundrum is like, you know, Black people are not gonna, I mean, maybe more Black people voted for Trump this time than before, but like, you know, Black people are gonna stay in the Democratic Party, but what is the Democratic Party gonna do for Black people? I think we've seen, you know, as, you know, you got your James Clyburns, folks, you got your Hakeem Jeffries, and they might talk a big game, but like, I don't know, like, tangibly tell me what are they doing with their work specifically benefiting Black people.
Taking that pharma money, that's it.
yeah, exactly. Like, and you know, I mean, so the Black misleadership class is a thing for sure. I'm not optimistic about Biden administration. doing much in that regard. So I think what does that mean for us? Like, we have to project the politics that says, like, this is what we think needs to be done for working people, for working class Black people, but working class people in general. This is our program for how, people get control over their economic lives, how people, are able to have power over where their lives go. And we have to talk to more and more people about that. We can't just talk to, our circle of friends on Twitter. We have to, like, get out there and talk to people that we don't normally talk to, people that won't necessarily agree with us, or people who might, like, look at us funny if we were to knock on their door. But we got to do that. And I think, yeah, like, so, like, I went to South Carolina ahead of the, South Carolina primary and canvass for Bernie, and I had conversations on doors with Black people who were like, every 4 years, these Democrats get out here and do everything they can to get me to show up on election day, and then I don't hear from them ever again. And then you hear about the House Democrats that lost, and AOC is now got some sharp words for these people, basically saying that, like, you guys don't organize, like, you don't do anything, and we got to organize in, like, not just like every 4 years, not just when the election cycle comes, and we want people to turn out and vote. We got to organize, like, every day as, like, a part of somebody's life. Like, what does it mean to, like, what does it mean to repoliticize people? I think people are often, just because people went out to vote in high numbers doesn't mean they're politicized. People are just going to go back to their lives. How do we make it so that people's lives are political? I think that's what we have to do. And we got to do that in working class communities of color. I think we're doing that. I mean, I think what we've done with the state slate and what we're going to do with the city council slate, I think is going to help us do that. What we're doing with the defund campaign, the public power campaign, what we're doing right now at the 100K drive, like, we're doing that. So we just got to keep at it.
Yep.
Cool. So that was the end of Stack. And I think if there's no more questions, I think, Mia, you can lead us into what's next.
Yes, I'm just going to paste the breakout questions into the general chat so that all of the facilitators have it in advance of the breakout rooms. And if you guys can just hang out for 1 sec, I have the breakout rooms already ready, and I will open those up soon.
Our group, maybe?
Yeah, so we spent a lot of time kind of discussing, like, the kind of like a question of ideology and, like, how that's baked into the way that we, like, perceive race, and the kind of, like, constructive angle of, like, it's something that was created historically, it's a historical process, and it can be undone through, like, working class solidarity. I found that was, like, that's always, like, very salient. And also went along to, like, discussing Reconstruction, and kind of talking about, like, the kind of, like, spread of democratic power. Would anyone else want to, like, add on? My memory is kind of bad today.
That sounds good to me. Does someone else from one of the other groups?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Group 2?
Who was group 2?
Go for it, Ann. You're group 4, just go. Who cares if you're out of order?
Yeah, exactly. Go ahead, Ann.
Yeah. Well, we were having a real key talk about, in terms of not only Black centrists, but centrists that are, let's just say, to still the right of Nina Turner, but arguably to the left of, Obama. And, one person in particular, obviously, is our Vice President-elect, turning down Kamala Harris, and also even Stacey Abrams as well, too, in terms of, like trying to effectively get in terms of a lot of, let's say, Black centrist voters, particularly those who have been maybe okay with us being used to our militarized state and accepting it, and as well as also the ways of our military industrial complex of easing and encouraging that support and trying to have a lot of Black people be supportive and the benefits to try to give them into that to ease that transition, as well as also about, you know, having that support for the ballot initiatives across like a whole Black perspective, particularly with affirmative action in California failing, obviously, again, on in terms of public workers. So that was something that, you know, was key with that. And, you know, and I think just the whole notion, even though we didn't talk about it here, of really tackling the systemic racism across the board is really essential towards that, as well as everything that happened with the South Carolina primary with Clyburn. Bernie did support Clyburn's 2030 bill and did show that solidarity, at least towards him, but that publicly, whether him, Jeff Weaver, they just didn't ask him for his endorsement, and how really reaching out to Black leaders or trying to make sure that perception is not being said that they weren't reaching out to Black leaders. So yeah.
Great. Someone want to?
Sure.
Someone from one of the other groups?
I'll go from group 3. We continued the conversation around, you know, sort of the class reductionist, quote unquote, and the race reductionist, quote unquote, debate. It's still, you know, constantly rages within DSA and within the left in many avenues, neoliberal, liberal as well. And we sort of, you know, try to, you know, to the extent that it expresses itself in our spaces, to the extent that we have to confront people who may have one or the other extreme, and trying to debate them, whether they're in our family or at work, trying to confront and, you know, bring back the analysis that I think most folks agree with, that, you know, class and race are inextricably linked, especially given the way that the ideology of, you know, capitalism and white supremacy molded society all these many years. And so we kind of landed on, you know, when you are, you know, to the extent that those viewpoints exist, you should not go in either extreme, because they can, you know, warp how you, you know, see the solutions to the issues that, you know, a lot of folks do agree exist, but figuring out how to solve them requires, you know, adjusting that lens that you view things through. And then we, so we kind of got stuck on the first question about ideology, tying to the questions at the end of Justin's presentation. So yeah, that was mostly it.
I have a cattail on my face at the moment, but that's really great. And next group.
Yep, so in group 2, I think our discussions took a similar course. We started from this place of discussing the creation of the ideology of race, how that originated, and how that was like a socially constructed sort of thing. Did take a little detour into the race and class reductionism question, grappled a bit with, you know, the failure of the Democratic Party to speak to working people consistently, and, you know, the ways in which that also doesn't serve like working class people in general, and how that specifically doesn't serve like Black working class people. And we also, I think in Doug's words in our group, you know, the notion of racism is like really a fundamental fissure in American society and American culture that's got to be, you know, resolved and dealt with in any conversation about class, not something that can be glossed over elegantly.
And is there one group left, I think?
Yeah, reporting back from group 5. I will try to remember everything, but we, for the most part, went through the questions, recapped a lot of the stuff that Justin went over really well in the presentation, and then started focusing on how we can use this for our strategy. So we were talking about making sure that like as we try to win like socialism and defeat capitalism so that we can defeat racism, the concept of like following through, holding everyone accountable, and then the idea of how to unite the working class. We spoke about like our own specific circumstances and how we can relate to people, and then discussed the concept of just building solidarity through things that actually target people's material needs, as ways to show that like, hey, white person, you also have just as much of a stake in this as Black people do, and similar sentiments like that. So, yeah.
And was that our last group? Was there one more?
That we had did group 6 report back? No.
Please do.
Oh, cool. Sorry. Yeah, no, we talked a little bit. We kind of had, conversations about, also kind of riffed on the talk about, class reductionism, on the left, and did talk a little bit. We referred to, Mia brought up, Jane McAlevy's, comments on labor, last week, and how we kind of, how the capitalist wants to see us, divided. So we talked, about the concept of solidarity and how identity politics without class politics are kind of, empty. So it was a really good discussion that we kind of ended up on the labor side of stuff.
Love ending on the labor side of stuff. Cool. So I think with that, we'll wrap up. Just a few announcements. So if you aren't a member of DSA, join DSA. You might have heard Justin mention that we're having a membership drive. New York has actually met its goal of 728 members referred, but we want to get more because the goal of the national organization is 100K members by the new year. So everyone should recruit at least 3 of your people, coworkers, friends, co-religionists, family, bodega friends, like whatever. Recruit them if they share our politics. Link is in the chat for recruiting. Definitely Tinder dates. I love that. If you want to get involved in organizing, like obviously all of our organizing in DSA is about the common liberation struggle, and as Justin so well put it, I think achieving liberation for all people. That said, we do specific organizing around race and around Black liberation, and so we're going to post in the chat 2 links. One is to the Racial Justice Working Group, which is right now working on our defund campaign, and the other one is the Afro-Socialist Caucus, which is a space for socialists of color in the organization to develop their politics and ideas. Then after that, next, night school. The next night school on November the 23rd in 2 weeks is on gender and capitalism, and is with Liza Featherstone, a North Brooklyn member, and people might have read her writing in many different venues, New Republic, Jacobin, many other places. Great speaker on gender and capitalism. And I also wanted to make sure to mention a month from now, so we meet every 2 weeks. So that's in 2 weeks, gender and capitalism. A month from now, we'll be talking about social movements and in part direct action and civil rights movement. So we'll be talking about the civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter. So there's like a nice tie between that and the future session. So please come to that. This Thursday, there's a new member orientation. I met some new members today. So do attend and find out more about how to get involved in DSA and what we do. We have tabling in Maria Hernandez Park this Saturday from 12 to 3 to defund the police and talk to our neighbors about that. And last but not least, if you want to get in touch with political education or get involved, we're going to pop our email in the chat. I think that's about it vis-a-vis announcements. Thank you, Justin, for the presentation. thanks so much to everybody for coming, and solidarity forever.